And now for some political analysis. Ruth Marcus is a columnist and the deputy editorial page editor of The Washington Post. Ramesh Ponnuru is a senior editor for the National Review and a columnist for Bloomberg View. We're also joined by Amy Walter, national editor of the Cook Political Report, and Time Magazine's Michael Duffy, who is the deputy editor. Michael, I want to start with you. What have we learned about the Trump presidency from this now more than a week-long saga of the executive order on immigration?
Well, I think there are a couple of takeaways, John. The first is that this is a White House that was keen from the start to create an impression of action, maybe disruption, certainly nationalism in its first week, no matter the cost to perhaps its reputation and even our alliances. It's a White House where there are a high number of people with unfettered access to the president, which means there are decisions that are made quickly, sometimes in secret, and not with the advice of all the advisors perhaps that are needed, which is not necessarily a formula for success. It's a White House where there's an unusual amount of finger-pointing and credit-taking, both by the White House aides and the president's family, members of the family, which suggests they're not all on the same page. And finally, after 2 weeks, they've yet to really put in place a decision-making process that fits a live tweeting president who can comment about anything at any time. And I'll say one more thing. The U.S. government is perhaps the largest single enterprise in the world. It has billions of dollars in lots of countries. Everyone's life is affected by it. Its reach is vast. It's not built for improv. It's a system that needs it's an enterprise that needs a decision-making system that is transparent at the very least to those who are expected to execute the policies, and ideally those of us who are subject to them. Mm-hmm. We'll find out this week whether the changes they say they've put into place last week are actually making a difference.
So much to unpack there. Ruth, what do you make of where things are legally at the moment?
Things are legally where they should be, which is in the courts before now a so-called appeals court. I'm sorry, I couldn't resist that. And we are going to do what we need to do in America, which is to find out, to test the legality of this and come to a conclusion. But whatever conclusion is reached by the courts, and I'm assuming that the Trump administration, after it finishes tweeting, will comply with the rule of law. I think there's a lot of fallout here. Mike talked about how you can't run the government by improv, and Vice President Pence talked about Washington niceties. These aren't just Washington niceties. They're questions about whether you can run this government, and it's lasting damage here. In his relationships with Congress, in his relationship with the country, which saw these terrible stories of people who needed medical treatment being denied, in his relationships with the courts, and in his relationships with the world. And more fundamentally, the lesson of the week to me is that we have a president who fundamentally is not understanding the role of courts. This tweet about so-called judges was not just something that we should ignore. And he doesn't understand the role of America as it has historically been in the world as a beacon of hope and a welcoming place for refugees.
Ramesh, Vice President Mike Pence said he didn't see this as a questioning of the judge's legitimacy, calling him a so-called judge. Are we making too much of that in the president's reaction to this?
Well, I think that President Trump has put the vice president in a difficult situation, and that is probably something that the vice president can expect going forward. Clearly, he did question the legitimacy of the judge. And I think one of the other things we learned about this administration from this episode that shouldn't be a great surprise is that it is prickly and defensive when it faces opposition, when it is criticized, that it is not capable of explaining itself very well. And I think we've seen that over the course of this. And then one other thing is that this administration is very, very concerned about keeping some of its promises. And what I think is interesting about this order is that it seems like less of an attempt to protect the country than to make good on campaign rhetoric by President Trump in a way that is a little bit more defensible legally than his initial call to just ban all Muslims. Right. If you were starting out trying to figure out a policy that bears a rational relation to national security without that previous rhetoric, I don't think that you would have landed here.
That's right. And the Cato Institute has looked into the actual terrorism as a result of refugees and found, I think, the chance that a refugee they put at 1 in something like 3-point-something billion that a refugee would commit terrorism. So this is a solution for a problem that doesn't exist, say some. Amy, the Hill, Republicans on the Hill that I talked to, they thought the policy was fine. But it wasn't just niceties. What one Republican said to me was, if he just made a few calls, they could have avoided hurting the very things that Donald Trump wants to promote.
I think this relationship between Donald Trump and Republicans is going to be fascinating. We knew it coming into this campaign. We watched the dance between conservatives and Trump, Republicans and Trump throughout, and now that dance is going to continue in Congress. But here's what we know is happening with voters, is that despite the fact that this president comes in with the lowest approval rating of any president at this point in his first term, he has got almost universal support from Republicans, 90% approval rating from Republicans. Most of these Republicans on Capitol Hill sit in districts that Donald Trump carried. There are only 23 Republicans who sit in a district that he didn't win. There's only one senator up in 2018 who sits in a state he didn't win. Their concern politically, they have other concerns, but their political concern, if they want to win re-election, is to make sure that those people that they need to support them, the voters who sit in those districts, who like Donald Trump, continue to support them in primaries, where they could be challenged by someone to the right if they feel like that member of Congress isn't adequately supporting Donald Trump. And so this is what we're going to be watching for, is will there be those breaks between the president and his party? It's hard to see those breaks happening when he has a 90% approval rating from the very people who go out and vote for those candidates.
But Amy, we've already seen some. We saw 2 Republican senators say this week that they wouldn't support his education secretary. We saw on the record criticism from people like Senator Rob Portman about the rollout of the immigration order. So I think that you're right about those tensions, and you're right about the basic impetus of people to support, but it's going to be a big mess.
But staying on this point, Ramesh, President Trump said he would come to Washington and be a disruptor, blow things up. If I am paying some attention but not watching every turn of this, and I look at what's happening in Washington, and I am a supporter of President Trump's, aren't I happy as can be that people are, unhappy here and fidgeting there and got their nose out of joint over here? I mean, isn't that the basic what this all boils down to?
A lot of people make the point that this president is more unpopular than previous presidents at this stage of the presidency, where usually a president's enjoying a honeymoon with the public. But the flip side of that is he's got his core support. Nothing he's doing is making him popular, but nothing he's doing is threatening his approval from those voters who are his core support.
In fact, I was going to say the discomfort and the mess is all to the good in their worldview. Don't forget, this is an administration that believes not just in disruption, but perhaps cyclical destruction of our political process. Go ahead.
Let me follow up on that, Michael, with you. And you mentioned the word improv. Steve Bannon, the president's senior advisor, is on the cover of Time this week. There is a way, though, or give me your sense about this, which is that there are realities that when you have other members of the administration looking over their shoulder, you talked about the leaks, people getting kind of attacked in the press by blind quotes. Talk a little bit about where this can get in the way of what an administration tries to do.
Well, one of the things I was trying to say earlier was that there has to be some kind of internal transparency so everyone knows what they're doing. Cabinet officers were caught off guard by this, and they look down the road and say, how many times will this happen to me before I have to leave? These are private conversations going on at a very high level because they worry that it won't be fixed. So even where the policies that they're executing fit with their campaign rhetoric, which I think was a great point, or are done in ways that make refugees is enjoying a 45% support in the public. There are simple matters of whether you can keep an administration moving forward on a broader agenda if you don't loop them all in at the start. So they're going to have to do that, and they're going to have to also learn that there will be disagreements at the highest levels that they'll have to work through.
And Ruth, some of these people who are, as Michael alluded to, General Mattis, General Kelly, Secretary Tillerson over at the State Department, I guess I shouldn't call them generals anymore. They're now secretaries. I apologize. These are big figures who have their own reputations and who the administration relies on for those powerful reputations. They're some of the ones who found conflict with this.
Yeah, indeed. And I think we're going to see going forward the degree to which they are willing to tolerate this kind of improv process that puts them in a difficult position going forward. And so I think you're going to you saw from the White House this week conversation about how they were going to need to put a more orderly process in place. Donald Trump set this up, by the way, with putting Steve Bannon and Reince Priebus, the chief of staff and the chief strategist, at explicitly equivalent levels. every president and every White House has learned this lesson. That doesn't work. You need to have a chain of command.
But if anybody's ever watched the campaign, this is how the campaign existed too. It was always a sense of chaos.
Or
always
his previous
about who
business
was,
career.
That's right. Everything was about that. If we've learned anything throughout the course of 2016 into 2017, Donald Trump is Donald Trump is Donald Trump. That's not going to change.
One of the other subtle promises of the campaign was, I'm going to run the government like a business. And he brought into his most senior positions generals and CEOs who believe in a chain of command, thrived in a chain of command, rose through a chain of command. So he's going to have to reinstate something if he wants to keep them.
And who many people thought would help him rein in his impulses, those people. All right, we're going to take a quick break here. We'll be right back, talk about Supreme Court, things overseas, lots more. Stay with us. And we're back with more from our political panel. Amy, I want to start with you. We talked about some ragged edges of the Trump presidency, but one that didn't seem to be, that one seemed to go pretty well was the naming of the Supreme Court pick. Kept it quiet. It's a pick that a lot of conservatives like. Do you see it that way?
Yeah, and it got a great reception on television, good ratings. President loves getting good ratings. This is, when I talked about this dance, this is another part of the dance, right? You're going to have members of Congress who complain about the messiness and with the rollout and even some of the issues that they may not agree with that the president's pushing forward. But then it seems that almost minutes later, he's able to present them with something that they desperately want: regulatory reform, a conservative Supreme Court justice. And so they are going to be constantly tested. Are we going to wait for our tax reform bill? But we got to go through all this other stuff that's messy and maybe we don't agree with and maybe it's so much more divisive than we wanted it to be. But we're going to get in return something we've always been dreaming about. And so that is going to be a constant sort of cross pressure on these members.
Ramesh, I want to ask you, get your reaction, but let me throw this in as well. Isn't this pick the culmination of a very cagey and smart move by Mitch McConnell long ago when President Obama had a chance to nominate somebody and Mitch McConnell said, no way. Donald Trump, then candidate Donald Trump, President Trump said during a debate, he said the message to Mitch McConnell is delay, delay, delay. That meant whoever the Republican nominee was going to be somebody who everybody voting for them knew was going to pick the choice on the court, and it kept liberals from having another seat on the court. So in retrospect, that was quite a move by the Senate Majority Leader.
Absolutely. And it was a move that faced a lot of second guessing at the time, particularly at times when Clinton was way ahead of Trump in the polls. A lot of Republicans were saying, maybe we should just confirm Merrick Garland, Obama's nominee, because Clinton might put in somebody more liberal. And it turned out that not only did that not happen, but the Supreme Court vacancy was probably an issue that helped propel Trump to victory. The exit polls do suggest that the Supreme Court was more of a motivating factor for Trump voters than it was for Clinton voters.
Ruth, will the court, presuming that, or assuming for a moment for the purposes of this question that Judge Gorsuch gets onto the court, will it be more conservative than when Scalia was on the court, or the same, or what's your sense of it?
There's going to be some really wonky changes involving how deferential to be to administrative agencies, and that'll depend on whether you're reviewing whether that's more or less conservative. It will depend on whether you're reviewing an Obama administration order or a Trump administration order. I think that the importance of this nomination, we kind of know how it's going to end, as you suggested, is kind of what happens in the chapters leading up to the conclusion of him being nominated, because that will tell us whether there's going to be a sequel, because that is the really important thing here. Whether Justice Kennedy will choose to retire, as he may be tempted to do, whether what happens if another justice, liberal justice, who really could change the balance of the court in a much more significant way than Justice Gorsuch would, will leave. And there's a lot of moving pieces here that have to do with whether the nuclear option will be triggered and people will be confirmed with just 50 votes.
Talk about that, Michael. A nuclear option being the Senate Majority Leader on the Republican side, basically breaking a Democratic filibuster if there is one. How do you see it playing out?
Yeah. Well, I think Ruth answered the question that he will eventually get in. The nuclear option is tricky for the Democrats mostly. It puts them in a tough spot. Their base is dying for blood. They would really like to, do to Gorsuch what McConnell did to Merrick Garland. They would like to see this group of Democratic leaders that is not particularly, heavily lefty, put up a fight, and especially with all the folks massing on the streets and the kind of organized nature in which the left has emerged after Trump's election. And so to them, I think the question of fighting Gorsuch is kind of like a basic litmus test. And that's hugely complicated for not just Nancy Pelosi in the House, but Chuck Schumer in the Senate, because they're facing this question coming on taxes and on spending and on trade. They're going to have to decide over and over again whether to fight, even if they can't win.
And it's not really a question. I'm sorry to interrupt you. It's not really a question for them because their base is going to demand it. But I think that the question of the nuclear option isn't just complicated for Democrats. It's not necessarily in their interest to deploy it, but it may be inevitable. It's a problem for Republicans because as Justice Kennedy, all eyes on Justice Kennedy, as he watches this, does he really want to be set off this kind of conflagration if he leaves? Does he really want a nominee who would only take 51 votes for confirmation to succeed him?
Add to that in terms of the Republican pickle.
Well, there's also a division as to whether the rules should be changed. And I do not believe there is currently a majority in the Senate for changing the rules. That's one of the reasons McConnell
to
is
essentially
not.
break the filibuster
Right, exactly,
and invoke the nuclear option.
Now, that could change as this process moves forward. It may be that Republican senators and Republican voters get sufficiently enraged by Democratic obstruction, Democratic filibusters, that the votes materialize. But that's something that I think McConnell is very mindful of, in addition to his own concerns institutionally about changing the rules.
Is there anything, Amy, that Chuck Schumer could get by pushing this, using this as a bargaining chip, knowing that he's going to essentially not be able to block the nomination, or block the confirmation, but
then
get something
hoping that
along the
he's
way?
right, that you sort of get a medal for good behavior, and then Mitch McConnell's going to say that's so great. That's why it's interesting to me to hear folks say, well, you know what, Democrats shouldn't go all in on this one. Let the vote come down. You're basically just replacing one conservative with another. Save the big fight for the next one. As if Mitch McConnell won't then use the nuclear option at the next one.
Right.
He has an opportunity to do it 2 points.
Ramesh, what's your view? We're going to switch quickly to Russia. What did you make of President Trump's comments to Bill O'Reilly?
Well, Vice President Pence said that there was no moral equivalence that Trump was drawing between the United States and Russia. Could have fooled me. It sure sounded as though that was exactly what Trump was saying, and it's what Trump has said before, and it's really an astonishing comment for a president of the United States to make. If you think about the things conservatives complained about from President Obama in terms of allegedly apologizing for the country, this is this is orders of magnitude worse.
And it's happening in the context in the last week of the Russian or Ukrainian separatists, depending on how you describe them, starting up skirmishing again in eastern Ukraine, which has been basically dormant for 2 years. So the signals coming from Washington about our relationship with Russia matter even more because of what signal that may be sending to Moscow about how to proceed in the former Soviet bloc states.
And Ruth, this week, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations said the dire situation in eastern Ukraine is one that demands clear and strong condemnation of Russian actions. That is a moral message being sent by one part of the government. Mm-hmm. How does that mesh? Who do you pay attention to, the president or the UN ambassador? If you're
I pay attention to the president because he's the head of this government. I agree with everything Ramesh said. It's unimaginable that a president of the United States would say this. And I would also point to the very lukewarm readout that was given of the president's conversation with the head of Ukraine, where it was a conversation about border conflicts. It's not a border conflict. There's a border conflict, between...
There's no more border anymore. Yeah, okay.
But
Quickly.
This is also a president who explicitly ran saying, I did not support the Iraq War. I think we were spending way too much time overseas. He's willing to criticize American foreign policy throughout. Should not be surprised he continues.
That's right. Okay. Thanks to all of you.